Hello everyone, this is Edgar with Team Lotus Box, and today I'm going to be talking about some Modern. As you may know, this month's Mana Creator Series event is Modern, and I qualified for the end of month event. And although I played the qualifying rounds with the Black-Red Lurrus Shadow deck that has been going around, I didn't really feel like it was the right choice going into this weekend, and I wanted to figure out something different in order to tackle the format a little bit better. And I actually arrived at this 5-color Niv deck that you see before you. And the reason I arrived here actually, it was kind of interesting. Um, Although I did well with the Black-Red Prowess deck, I was playing a lot of mirror matches. I'm playing against a lot of the Blue-Red Prowess variant. Humans was on the rise, and they were playing a bunch of copies of Auriok Champion as well. And of course, the snow decks, the Uro piles, were ever present. So uh, that felt to me like what the metagame was shaping up to be. And on the sideline of that, there was also the various new zero land, I suppose, combo decks you can call them. The Oops All Spells decks. They use Ballad Spy to build their own deck, and the Goblin Charbelcher decks. Similar decks in terms of positioning in the format, but somewhat different, but accomplishing the same thing. So those decks were on the rise, and that seemed to me to be like the three pillars that I was trying to beat going into this weekend. And I couldn't really think of anything that beat all three handily, which is pretty normal, right? You have your aggro deck, your control deck, your combo deck. It's not always easy to beat all three, but this deck felt to me like it had really good game against the aggressive pillar of the format. This deck is incredibly good against the Shadow Prowess decks. And of course it can keep toe to toe with the Uro piles as well, keeping up with advantage if not outcarding them. And that only left the combo aspect of the metagame, which admittedly is a little shaky for this deck, but that really kind of informed my decision-making process for how I want to build this specific sideboard and specific main deck. But I'll get to that more a little bit later. But yeah, basically this 5-color Niv deck, it's something that I've played in the past. Um, Couple formats ago now, I suppose, back when Astrolabe was still legal. And although this deck did lose Astrolabe, it did gain Omnath Locus Creation, which I think is actually a pretty big power level increase for the deck, just holistically. So in addition to this deck being somewhat well positioned in my eyes, beating up on uh, what I believe to be the most common played archetype of prowess, it also just got a across the board power level increase, which of course is always a reason to revisit a strategy. But yeah, Omnath, all the talk in standard, but this deck very much capable of utilizing all the abilities on this card to full effect. And the mana ability, of course, is very powerful with your powerful 5 drops, namely Niv-Mizzet Reborn, letting you have some very insane swingy turns with this deck. If you have a Utopia Sprawl or an Uro, you can play your Omnath on turn 4 with a fetch land, fetch any black land, and cast either Bring to Light or Niv-Mizzet. Um, so yeah, very powerful swingy turns, and surprisingly not as gimmicky as I may have originally thought when I saw this card being presented as an idea in this deck. So let's go into the more minute decisions of the deck, I suppose. I talked previously about Astrolabe being gone in the format, and unfortunately not a fantastic replacement, but Utopia Sprawl is the card of choice to replace Astrolabe. Um, Again, of course, not doing the same thing, but this is a card that has actually existed in this deck before, so not completely from left field that we're seeing it here. Just obviously really important for the ramp, really important for the mana fixing. You actually do get more explosive draws than you did with the Astrolabe variant of the deck, since you were able to cast 3 drops on turn 2, which was impossible before. But in addition to the Utopia Sprawls, the mana base I hadn't mentioned yet, very very complicated to build, I suppose. I put a lot of thought into this. The two tri-lands, every fetchable land in the deck is actually a forest, besides the basics, of course. All the fetchable duals and tri-lands. They're all forests, except for the steam vents. And that's kind of the way the deck is built, or the mana base is built. If you're only functioning on two lands, you do have these two tri-lands that you could possibly get, and you cover all 5 colors of mana that way. But every fetchable land has its purpose. There's obviously a lot of really minute sequencing decisions that you have to make, depending on how your hand is structured, the possible spells you might draw. So if you are going to play this deck, I would very much stress practicing or thinking really hard about the sequencing of lands. So yeah, Utopia Sprawl is subsidizing all of that, of course. But in addition to that, I actually think that Ren is a pretty important aspect of the mana base, especially with the increased fetch land count. I wanted to play more fetches than would be typical, I suppose, because of Omnath. You really want to have a fetch land the turn you play Omnath in order to take advantage of the mana ability as easily as possible. So there's extra fetch lands on the deck, and then of course that helps to fuel your Ren and 6 as well. And Ren, when it's in your opening hand, just lets you keep such a wider range of hands. And of course this deck is incredibly mana hungry. You have Niv-Mizzet, you have Uro, so just hitting all your land drops up to 10 or 12 or whatever it may be is super important. And I really do think that Ren and 6 is an extension of the mana base, and I've seen a lot of lists with fewer than 4 copies, but I would certainly not, or I would advise against that, I suppose. So yeah, let's move on from the mana. The spells can look a little bit random at times, I will admit, but I put a lot of thought into the various removal spells that we have access to. So yeah, I'm going to start with the removal. For Lightning Helix, I've seen less of this card. I've tried shaving it down on it and playing more copies of other stuff, but I think it's just way too important. You have a lot of really powerful 3-mana spells, and I think that Lightning Helix does a better job at bridging the gap into your later game than basically anything else. And the new Death Shadow S card from the new set also checks your life total, so gaining the life there is relevant. Just obviously life gain really good at breaking the gap and letting you get to your powerful late game spells, and I've been really happy with 4 Lightning Helix, even though I've seen less copies of that. For Assassin's Trophy, there were 2 copies of this. I did cut one for a Maelstrom Pulse, just to have a little bit more variety with the tutors. Just your versatile catch-all. It's not really a 2-mana spell trophy, but it can be in a pinch, and I think it's just really important to have access to various cards that have the possibility of being super high impact in certain scenarios, and both Assassin's Trophy and Maelstrom Pulse are that type of card. Like, if your opponent has an Inkmoth Nexus, sometimes there's just no other card that can answer it besides a card like Assassin's Trophy, and it's just really, really important to have access to even just one of those in order to give yourself that possibility. Something I haven't touched on yet, that I'll touch on now, is the fact that I'm actually playing Gigantha as my companion, which is something I went back and forth on. And the reason I decided to do that was not because I necessarily needed more gas or needed more mana, but more because with Omnath, you do have a lot more turns where you have mana that you don't use fully. So you can use that in order to cast your Gigantha and just create a bigger board presence that can be difficult for your opponent to attack around, especially when people are playing cards like Temur Battle Rage or Monastery Swiftspear just to try to get in some extra chip damage. Just every body counts. But actually the bigger reason I decided to play Gigantha was because I was seeing a rise in the card Blood Moon, and I think that is actually one of the more effective ways to tackle that card. if you're on the play or you have a hand that allows it, you can often play around Blood Moon using your Utopia Sprawls, your fetch lands to get basics, etc. Depending on what your answer is, like sometimes just fetching a forest and putting a sprawl on it and naming either black for trophy or blue for bring to light, and that's good enough to answer Blood Moon on its own, but you don't always have that luxury. And sometimes, especially when you're on the draw, you're kind of just forced to play a tap land on turn 1 just to have the possibility to sequence your spells properly and not lose to a normal draw, and in those draws, Blood Moon can be really annoying. And I was finding that Gigantha was actually fairly relevant in those games where your opponent was relying on Blood Moon and you could just put that into play, and it was usually pretty difficult for them to deal with because they're usually just Lightning Bolt decks and they need 2 pieces of interaction after that. But yeah, since we were talking about the main deck, the reason I brought up the Gigantha is because the companion cost is a cost. There's no other way to put it, and the only card that I feel like I'm actually losing out on is a main deck copy of Supreme Verdict, which is something that I typically have played in this deck in the past, and you see a lot in these lists. And that had to be cut in order to play the Gigantha, which I will admit is a fairly large cost, and it's basically the only thing that has made me hesitant about playing it. But I decided to play a Deafening Clarion in that spot just to have access to a sweeper. Now, of course, it's not going to answer any of the big things. The situations where I was most worried about not having the Supreme Verdict was against stuff like a Jund Death Shadow deck with Tarmogoyfs, or just the card Death Shadow itself that's too large to deal with. But you got to pick your poison, and I decided to just go with a Clarion. You could play like an Extinction Event in that spot, but Extinction Event wasn't that good against the 2-mana Shadow, since they're much better at diversifying their mana costs. So I guess went with the Clarion. It's a better natural draw against stuff like Prowess. Has a little bit more impact there, and it's been okay. Even if they have like a lot of small creatures and like one big creature, often the Clarion can pick off the small creatures, and if you have like one Omnath or one Niv-Mizzet, the lifelink will buy you a turn, and then you can just answer the big creature next time. Not the perfect replacement, but it's been suitable enough to warrant allowing the Gigantha. Kaya's Guile is a card that I wish I had more of, but unfortunately the mana cost is actually somewhat restrictive for Kaya's Guile. Not that black-white is typically that difficult to have at some point in the game, but it's very difficult to have on turn 3 sometimes, which kind of makes me hesitant to have a lot of them. Black is definitely the 5th color in the deck, I suppose you could say. And the main reason for that is actually Omnath. You never really want to fetch a swamp in the early game, and often just fetching a black dual can be really costly. So having a bunch of Kaya's Guiles was kind of causing more harm than good for me, so I opted to play very few copies of that. But having access to the first is really good. You get paired against Boggles, you get paired against some sort of graveyard deck. I did speak about the Oops All Spells decks, the Balustrade Spy decks. If you have a Kaya's Guile, they can't combo off, so there are situations where it comes up, and I liked having access to one of them. So that's the removal suite, game 1. Next I'll look at the threats, which I already spoke about Omnath a lot, but I started with a couple copies of this card and just very quickly went up to the full 4. It's just so good at doing exactly what this deck wants to do. You take advantage of every mode. The life gain is good at bridging the gap. The mana is obviously good at having really explosive turns. You are a tap-out control deck, and just having access to all that extra mana on your turn is just so powerful. And it pairs really well with the 5-drops, obviously. When you play your Omnath and your fetch land, you have access to 5 mana, and you can cast either Bring to Light or Niv-Mizzet, and just restock your hand. And that's kind of just the engine of the deck, and it's your kind of main game plan is to just interact in the early turns using your removal spells and just make your land drops, and then you have one turn where they have a medium-sized board and you kind of slam one of your haymakers, and then they can't kill you through it, and then the next turn you just have a bunch of cards to deal with whatever they have left over. And of course, to supplement these threats, we do have Uro, a very powerful card. I'm sure I don't need to speak very much about it. And Teferi is just a nice versatile card. Teferi is actually the best kind of like proactive card you can play in this deck. You don't take advantage of the minus all that much like on any of your own stuff. You can't bounce your Niv-Mizzet or Omnath to get some extra cards, but usually those are kind of wand games anyways. But it's mostly like a defensive tool that has a lasting effect. You can use it to bounce a creature if they only have one creature. And of course it's very good against the control decks. The Uro piles that I was talking about earlier, it can be very difficult for them to beat it, especially if you can stick it early with the Utopia Sprawl or just get it under their initial counter magic. So after that, we have one kind of Haymaker bullet with the Unmoored Ego. This card is obviously incredibly bad in a lot of matchups. I won't say otherwise, but when you have access to Bring to Light, basically every one of in your deck just becomes a 4-of, right? And this is the type of card that kind of just wins games on its own, and I think it's a pretty big mistake to not have access to this when you have all these tutors. Against Oops, you can name the Salvage Titan. If they're playing the new version of the deck, you name Salvage Titan, and they're unable to combo against you. Against Carbelcher, you name Carbelcher. Against Tron, you can name one of their Tron lands if you're on the play. There's just a lot of reasons that this card can just single-handedly win the game, and just a 1-of is such a low opportunity cost that I think it would be a mistake not to play it. And finally, for the main deck, we do have 2 copies of Glittering Wish. I was toying with more of these. Originally I thought that this card was going to be better because of the extra mana from Omnath, but that actually ended up being a little bit win more. But I do think that Glittering Wish kind of does serve a really strong role in this deck. It's a card that gets sideboarded out a lot, but it's really, really good game 1 at making sure that your draw and your answers are functional against whatever your opponent's playing. And I know that kind of sounds a little weird, but the way that the deck is constructed is you have a lot of really high impact cards, but that can kind of cause you to draw cards that aren't high impact in the right matchup. And Glittering Wish is the type of card that is just always going to be a high impact card in that matchup as long as you have the mana to cast it. Now, that can sometimes be a big if, but typically it's just going to be a big enough hammer. You're going to find your Wrath against the creature decks, you're going to find your anti-combo card against a combo deck. It's just going to be a really, really strong card when you get to cast it, and I think that's a good enough reason to play it. And this is going to segue really nicely into our sideboard, because although I want this to be a really powerful card and to help shape our draws, I do think it's important whenever you're playing these wishes to really think about the wish targets that you're playing and to kind of slim them down as much as possible. So I tried to do that, so I'm going to pull out the wish cards here. And the cards that I view as actual wish targets are definitely these 7. Now, the beauty of this deck is that the wish targets are, for the most part, only wish targets in game 1. Against all but a few decks, you do board out the wishes and just board in the targets, and then you have a really rounded 60. You get to take out the Unmoored Ego when it's bad, you got to take out the Wrath when it's bad, etc. And then you just build a good 60 as opposed to having this like kind of middle way 60 with a good catch-all. The times you do keep in the wish though is when you have this super powerful Haymaker that you really want to draw and it's going to win the matchup on its own. And it's basically the way I have the deck constructed. I keep in the Glittering Wishes whenever I want to Wheel and Sun and Moon my opponent or Unmoored Ego my opponent. In those 2 situations, you can wish on turn 2 and then cast this card on turn 3, and if it's going to win you the game a high percentage of the time, I think it's worth keeping. I suppose the Niv is a wish target as well. But outside of these 2 cards, these Haymakers that win the game on their own, we kind of have like 6 utility cards, and the way I have this broken down is I have 2 various Wraths, one smaller Wrath, one bigger Wrath. Obviously, there are going to be situations where one is good and the other is not, so I think that's kind of like the only overlap in the wish board, because sometimes you need a Fire Spell, sometimes you need a Verdict. It just depends on the size of your opponent's creatures, how much time you have, etc. But then besides that, I have one hard answer. So this is like the catch-all removal spell for your wishes, a hard counter spell, so when you're ahead on board, you can wish for the counter spell, or you're playing against a combo deck, you can wish for the counter spell, and 1 proactive threat. And I think that Teferi is actually the best one. I've tried an Uro in this spot as well. I basically wanted a 3-mana spell that I could curve Wish into in order to make my draws functional a higher percentage of the time, and I think Teferi does the best job at that. Uro might be slightly better in a lot of spots, but Teferi does have the added benefit of being somewhat of a hate piece as well against some decks, if you play against a Reclamation deck or just a control deck in general. So that's kind of why I got the nod as opposed to Uro, which would kind of be a more generically good card, but maybe less swingy. And like we were talking about earlier, I think with the Wish, you really want it to be high impact when you cast it, and that's why I went with the Teferi. And then the Niv-Mizzet is just to kind of have redundancy on late games. It lets you turn your, like when you Niv-Mizzet into a bunch of cards, you get to cast all those cards and you find another Niv-Mizzet. Sometimes, most of the time that's just a Bring to Life, but then that turns your Glittering Wishes into another Niv-Mizzet as well. And so that's the Wish package, and the reason I wanted to keep this as small as possible is because what we were talking about earlier, I felt really comfortable against the Prowess decks. I felt pretty good against the control decks. You can kind of keep toe-to-toe with them. The combo decks are a little bit more of an issue, and I really wanted to make sure I had room for 4 copies of Thoughtseize in my sideboard. Now, this is a card that you actually don't see a lot in this deck. Typically, you see either Veil of Summer or Mystical Dispute in this slot, maybe something like a Boil as a hate card for the Uro decks. But I really wanted to play 4 Thoughtseize this week, and that's because I wanted this slot to overlap with the control decks and the combo decks to kind of increase my percentages there where I felt the worst, as opposed to making sure I was beating the Prowess decks even more, even though I felt favored against them. And this card is just kind of the best thing you can be doing. With there being 2 different combo decks, you unfortunately can't tackle them the same way with like hate permanents. I can't just play a bunch of Wheel of Sun and Moons, because if they're just playing Belcher instead, then I get then it's not effective. I can't just play a bunch of like Stony Silence type cards, because if they're playing Oops, then it doesn't work, etc. So I really felt like Thoughtseize was the best thing I could be doing in this slot, and I really wanted to make sure that I had access to 4 of those. And then Ashiok is kind of my other hate card, just in case I see a Titan deck. It's still a Glittering Wish target, and if you play against like a more traditional Dredge deck, that can be somewhat of an issue for this deck as well, and it kind of overlaps there as well. So yeah, that's basically the entire thought process around how I arrived at this deck. Besides that, sideboarding, fairly intuitive, I think. May not be totally, may not be your first instinct to think that it's intuitive, but honestly, it just sideboards a lot like a control deck. The only thing I would say is unintuitive is when to leave in Wish and when to board out Wish. And I already mentioned that earlier. I think that Wish is really good when post-board, when it's getting a card that you think is going to win the game on its own a high percentage of the time. And the way I have the deck constructed right now, that's just Ego and Wheel. If Wish isn't getting Ego or Wheel after board, I do take it out and just build a good 60 and play like that. So in those situations, the Niv does come in, and whatever various card, when you're playing against a control deck, you board out removals, you board out Wraths, bring in Thoughtseize, you bring in your extra threats, your Teferi, you bring in your Niv-Mizzet. When you're playing against aggressive decks, you board out your Ego, you board out Teferis if they're a burn-based deck, bring in your extra removal, bring in your trophy, bring in your Wrath. The only other thing I suppose I should mention with sideboarding is to keep in mind when you board in either the Supreme Verdict or the Ashiok. I did want the Supreme Verdict in my sideboard, like I mentioned earlier, as a card to get with the Glittering Wish, but also so that I have access to board it in for Bring to Life when I want to. In those situations, you can't reveal Gigantha after board, so when you're choosing to board in these two cards, you need to weigh whether or not they're better than having access to Gigantha, which for the most part is true, but there are situations where that can swing. For example, if you're trying to board in Ashiok as kind of like a minor hate card against, like, let's say you're playing against a blue-white control deck with Snapcaster Mages and the accumulated knowledge card, you might be tempted to board in Ashiok because you can deal with Snap, you can get a little bit of value, mill yourself to an Uro, but maybe just having access to Gigantha as an extra card is more valuable there. So that's the only situations where you need to keep that in mind. The Wheel of Sun and Moon obviously never comes in, because when this is effective, you would rather have 2 copies of it with the Glittering Wish. But yeah, that's about it. Very excited to play this deck. I've been doing pretty well with it. Definitely a lot of tinkering you can do with it. Obviously a lot of really powerful cards when you're playing all 5 colors that you have access to, but this is where I arrived, and this is what I'm going to be playing going forward. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. See you next time.